What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to be brewing up a batch of Scottish ale, which is not something I have brewed for a very long time. And specifically today, we're going to be making a Scottish export. I am really excited about this beer. It is a very underbrewed and underappreciated style of beer, which is why it's perfect for homebrewers. It's been a really long time since I brewed a Scottish style ale. In fact, it's been over 4 years. The last one I made was a wee heavy when I was living in New Hampshire in my old apartment. So a lot of time has passed since then. And the last time I drank a Scottish style ale was, well, when I was on my honeymoon in Scotland. So it's been a long time. And this is a beer style that I really love. And it's a really special one too. Scottish style ales as we know them today really came to be through the brewing prowess of the city of Edinburgh, where they were making these really easy drinking, malt forward, darker styles of beer that were quite different from the more hoppy and slightly paler colored beers of England. Just like English beers, Scottish ales have subcategories within them that kind of separate them out based on strength in terms of ABV. The BJCP that we use nowadays separates this out into Scottish Light, Scottish Heavy, and Scottish Export. And then of course there's the Wee Heavy as well, which is the strongest variant of a Scottish style ale. Keep in mind though that the Export, despite being the strongest version of a regular Scottish style ale, is only really going to top out around 5.5% to 6% alcohol, which isn't really all that strong by today's standards. These sort of subcategories of Scottish ale used to be referred to by a shilling system. The antiquated shilling system was essentially just used to differentiate various strengths of beer based on the pre-tax prices of the barrel of beer when it was established. The system isn't really used all that much anymore, although some folks still do refer to it, and so the beer that we're brewing today is closest to what would be considered an 80 shilling ale. Scottish style ale today, though, is a really interesting beer style. It's quite alive and well in the area. Having had several examples while I was on my honeymoon in Edinburgh, it was awesome. Really is a beer style that I came to enjoy quite a bit. There's a characteristic darker color to Scottish style ales versus English ales. There's also a characteristic cleanliness to the fermentation character. Scottish ale yeast is a notably clean yeast. It does not throw nearly as many esters as English or Irish ale yeasts. It's also kind of attuned to fermentation at a lower temperature as well. It does very well all the way down to the mid-50s Fahrenheit, which is actually quite impressive for an ale yeast. Henceforth, it does kind of lend a very clean character to the fermentation. It's this very clean fermentation characteristic when coupled with a very malt-forward recipe design that makes a very characteristic Scottish-style ale. And that's what we're going for today. Despite being so malt-forward, though, these are very easy to drink. A couple things to note here. While you want to have roasted malts in the grist to help with that color contribution, which is characteristic of the style, it's important not to go overboard. We don't want significant roasted flavors in this beer. You want a hint of them, perhaps, but not much more than you might add to, say, a Schwarzbier. It should not have prominent roasted flavors per the BJCP. Also, according to the BJCP, peated malt is not a characteristic ingredient. I'm not going to tell you not to use it because I've had plenty of fine Scotch-style beers that have peated malt in them or smoked malt of some kind in them or are finished with a smoke kind of character. But the point is, if you're entering it into a competition of some kind under a Scottish style ale, hold off on the smoked malt or enter it as a specialty beer. Before we jump into the recipe, I just want to give a quick shout out to Clawhammer Supply, who manufacture the system I'll be brewing this beer on. It's their 10-gallon 240 volt system. They have both a 240 and 120 volt electric system, as well as a 10-gallon and a 20-gallon version of each system. I do recommend you check them out. They're fantastic brewing gear. So we're going to be shooting for a beer that's going to come out to be about 5% alcohol with a good amount of maltiness behind it. There's a lot of specialty malts in this beer, although in a very low concentration. So we're starting out with 8 pounds of Simpson's Golden Promise. Golden Promise is a classic Scottish base malt, and it's one of my favorite pale ale malts of all time. It sits somewhere between basic two-row pale malt and Maris Otter in terms of breadiness and sweetness and complexity. And it's a really nice base malt. So we're starting out with 8 pounds of that. We're gonna add 1 pound of Munich malt to the whole thing to add extra breadiness and depth to the beer. And then we're going to start adding in our specialty malts. Starting out first with 3/4 pound of Simpson's Golden Naked Oats. These are basically a crystal malt version of an oat. It comes in around like 7 to 8 lava bond. What the effect of this is going to sweeten the beer a little bit, it's gonna add a little bit of color, and it's going to give a nice characteristic oaty smoothness, which is something that I'm absolutely after in this beer style. And next we're gonna add a series of crystal malts. So 4 ounces of Simpson's Crystal DRC, which is a dark roasted specialty crystal malt from Simpson's that is fantastic in terms of bringing out these dark raisin characteristics and subtle fruitiness, as well as a nice dark red color. It's a very common ingredient in dark milds for a good reason. It's very characteristic to that flavor profile, which is something I want in this particular beer. It's very similar to Special B in terms of the effect that it has. We're gonna layer on top of that 4 ounces of Simpson's Crystal Light, which is gonna give a golden raisin character as well as a little bit more sweetness, and 4 ounces of Crystal Medium, which should get us a nice classic caramel character, as well as a little bit more kind of mild, dark dried fruit character. Lastly, we will add 4 ounces of Thomas Fawcett Pale Chocolate Malt, which is gonna give this delightful nutty character, as well as a little bit of a subtle roast character as well. Maybe some dark fruit and some chocolate character from that. And then lastly, to dial in that color to about 20 SRM perfectly, to get us a little tiny bit of extra roast flavor, and then maybe some like dark chocolate flavors, is 2 ounces of Weyermann Carafa Special 3, which is a dehusked roasted malt. This is gonna basically give us all of the benefits of roasted malts without the drawbacks of astringency and, you know, kind of intense, harsh flavors. I will also note that these roasted malts are going to be added at the very end of the mash, so that we're not keeping them in the mash for a long time to generate extra astringency. This is something I typically do, especially when I'm doing an overnight mash like I am today. So, you know, I don't want these roasted malts sitting in there at temperature for too long because that can generate astringency. But I do want the color contribution and that flavor contribution, which we can absolutely get by adding them at the very end of the mash. For hops in this beer, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, these are not hoppy beers at all. We just want enough bitterness for balance, and that is it. I'm still in the process of cleaning some old bittering hops out of my freezer, so all I'm gonna be doing is adding a single 60-minute hop addition, 3/4 of an ounce of Boudica, which, side note, is named for a Celtic warrior priestess, which is, I feel like that's kind of fitting for a Scottish style ale. And that should give us about 19 IBUs of overall bitterness to balance everything out. For the water profile in this beer, I'm aiming for a water profile that is going to offer a little bit of an increased chloride to sulfate ratio, which should really promote that maltiness and smoothness of this beer style. That water profile is going to be 77 parts per million of calcium, 13 parts per million of magnesium, 26 parts per million of sodium, 136 parts per million of chloride, 107 parts per million of sulfate, and 0 parts per million of bicarbonate. Normally for a darker beer like this, and classically Scottish ales also have high levels of bicarbonate, but because I'm adding in those dark roasted malts at the end of the mash, and they're not sitting in there for a long time, I don't need to worry too much about the pH buffering levels there. So I'm actually not going to add any sort of bicarbonate in there, which is actually much, much easier that way. In order to get that water profile, we're gonna be starting out with 8 gallons of reverse osmosis water and adding to that 6 grams of calcium chloride, 2 grams of sodium chloride, 4 grams of Epsom, and 3 grams of gypsum. For the yeast in this beer, I'm using the classic McEwen strain of Scottish ale yeast. This is Imperial A31 Tartan. This is really kind of the definitive Scottish ale strain. It's a clean, malt-forward, high attenuating ale yeast that has a great alcohol tolerance and is a fantastic multi-purpose yeast, by the way, not just for Scottish ales. I've used it many times before in several different types of beer, but it is truly the go-to for a Scottish style ale. And lastly, for the mash in this beer, it's gonna be an overnight mash at 154 degrees Fahrenheit. This is effectively just gonna get programmed into my controller, my Blickman Brew Commander. It's gonna hold a 60-minute rest at 154, automatically step up to a 15-minute mash out at 170, and then let it fall back down to 154, and keep it there for the rest of the night until I come back the next morning to carry on with the brew day. I've been doing the overnight mash method quite a bit now since my kid was born last year, and it's really helped me save time because even though I'm spending overall more time with the beer, I'm actively spending less time away from my family, if that makes sense. This really is, I believe, the key to still making great beer and being able to brew still with a young kid, but not spending too much time away from my family and not compromising on the beer quality either. I'm excited to see how this one turns out. As I said, it's been a long time since I've made or drank one of these types of beers, so let's get into it.
I started out by collecting 8 gallons of reverse osmosis water into my 10-gallon 240-volt clawhammer supply electric system and started to heat that up to the mash temperature of 154. While this was going on, I milled out all of my grain and separately milled the roasted grains, as those would be added later after the mash was completed. I also measured out my water salts at this time and added those into the strike water as it was heating up. When my system had reached 154 degrees, I doughed in with the entire grain bill minus the chocolate malt and Carafa Special 3. Mixed it all up thoroughly and allowed it to sit for about 10 minutes before pulling a pH sample. I cooled off the pH sample with some whiskey rocks and found a slightly lower than anticipated but still on target pH of 5.1. I did not make any adjustments for pH and left the mash to continue sitting undisturbed overnight at 154. My automated system kept it at 154 for an hour, ramped it up to 170 for a quick mash out, and then let it sit back at 154 for the rest of the night. I came back the next morning and found the mash sitting at 154, so at this point I immediately added in my roasted grains and stirred them up thoroughly. I allowed them to sit and steep in the mash for about 15 minutes before pulling out the grain basket and allowing that to drain for another 15 minutes. As soon as that was completed, I started heating up to a boil. When I hit the boil, I added my first and only hop addition at 60 minutes, which was 3/4 of an ounce of Burica. I let the boil continue for 50 minutes, and at the 10-minute mark, I added in some yeast nutrient and a Whirlfloc tablet. 10 minutes after that, I ended the boil, started a quick whirlpool to pile up all the trub and hop debris in the center of the kettle before transferring, and then chilled in one pass through my counterflow chiller and passed into my Spike CF5. I completed the chilling process and brought the entire batch temperature down to about 62 degrees before pitching in my starter of Imperial A31 tartan. I took a quick sample for an original gravity measurement and found it to be a bit higher than planned at 1054, which just indicates that overnight mashing was pretty efficient as usual. At this point, I tossed in my newly acquired Tilt Pro and left it to ferment.
For the fermentation on this beer, there's a pretty wide temperature range that you can successfully ferment Scottish ale yeast at. Although classically, it's typically been fermented at the lower end of that range. So typically around the low 60s Fahrenheit. So that's what I'm gonna be doing. I have a natural ambient temperature in my basement right now of about 60 degrees. I'm gonna warm that up a little bit and go for 62 degrees. We're just gonna ferment straight up 62 degrees for the entirety of the fermentation. It'll probably take 10 to 14 days to complete, especially at that lower temperature. And of course, to kind of make things a little bit easier, I'm gonna be using some ALDC enzyme to prevent any unnecessary diacetyl production and to get the beer into the kegs sooner. Classically, these beers are 100% clear. Their darker color does make it a little bit tougher to pick up on that, but they can be really quite nice when they're brilliantly clear, especially if they pick up the light, you get that ruby sheen on the beer. It really should be a nice treat. So I am gonna let this one clarify, although I think I'm gonna let this one just naturally clarify. I'm not really gonna rush. I'm not getting this packaged for anybody in particular, so it's always better to let it just take that time to condition, develop, and then naturally clarify. If that for some reason isn't happening, then maybe I'll add a little bit of gelatin to clarify it. I'm not gonna worry too much. Typically, these are gonna be beers that are served on cask. I am electing to not do that this time. I know you guys probably wanted to see me break out the beer engine for this one, but the beer engine is in need of maintenance and I am in need of time to maintain it. So it's gonna go on a keg and just get served on draft. That's just the way things are gonna be for this video. If you're not using the Imperial version of Scottish Ale yeast, it's also available as White Labs WLP 028 Edinburgh Scottish Ale, Y-Yeast 1728 Scottish Ale, and Omega OYL 015. All of these, I believe, are the same exact strain, which is that Mick Ewan's Scottish Ale strain. Again, fantastic, clean, easy fermenter. It's very tolerant yeast. It's very, very versatile yeast, and will push that malt to the forefront. If for some reason you can't find Scottish Ale yeast, I'd recommend Irish Ale yeast as a substitute, which is gonna be Imperial Darkness White Labs WLP 004, Omega OYL 005, or Y Yeast 1084. These are all the Guinness strain. This is going to give you just about as clean of a beer if you ferment it on the lower end, with maybe a little bit of a berry ester, which can actually be very complementary towards the suite of flavors that you get from this recipe. But if you can't find the Irish ale strain as well, then my recommendation finally would be the fuller strain of English ale yeast. This is going to be Imperial Pub, or White Labs WLP 002, Omega OYL 016, and Y Yeast 1968. This strain is going to deliver a lot more malty punch. It's going to still be relatively clean. There might be some characterful English esters in there, but for the most part, it's going to be relatively clean and malty. That being said, this particular strain produces very full-bodied beers. So if you're going to be making this recipe in the exact same way, I'd recommend taking some steps to reduce the body or the mouthfeel of the beer a little bit. Maybe add a little bit of adjunct in, or perhaps mash at a lower temperature just to kind of fight off that glycerol fullness you get from the fuller strain. Any of these three strains of yeast are going to get you a great beer at the end of the day, so don't sweat too much over it. But at the end of the day, you're just looking for a clean, malt-forward, high-performing ale yeast. As always, make sure you're taking good care of your fermentation, pitching enough yeast, pitching it at a low temperature, and giving it adequate aeration prior to pitching the yeast. All of these things will help you get a successfully clean fermentation as well. But anyway, just to recap, I'll be using the Scottish ale strain and fermenting this one at 62 degrees Fahrenheit for a total of about 10 to 14 days before packaging it and getting it ready to serve. I'm really looking forward to the final result in this beer, and I'll catch you guys when that is ready. So until then, cheers.
Despite being fermented around 62 degrees the entire time, the fermentation still was very fast. And my Anton Par SmartRef plot would have you believe that it was 5 days from pitching yeast to the final gravity, but the Tilt Pro shows more interesting information in that it was more like a little over 24 hours that it took to hit the final gravity. Regardless, I still let the beer condition for another week before kegging it and getting it ready to serve. So the beer is called Boudica's Broadsword, and it comes in at 5% ABV and 19 IBUs. The color of the beer is incredible. It's this really, really nice, dark, rich, brownish red color. It has a beautiful clarity to it. And while most of the time it's just appearing as a brown color, when it hits the light just right, you get this nice red flash in the beer. It's really quite nice to watch. For the head on the beer, it's pouring a really nice, fluffy, kind of off-white cream colored head. It sticks around for a decent amount of time too, which is nice to see.
All right, so now let's go in for aroma. The aroma on this is really strong and malty. It's so just robust, and the number one characteristic that I am getting out of this particular beer, its aroma, is just like a nuttiness, like a toasted hazelnut kind of character. It is a really prominent and quite pleasant aroma. No hoppiness, no yeast character whatsoever. Just that really nice, robust maltiness. Very satisfying, and it lets you know that, yeah, this is gonna be a pretty flavorful drink overall. Let's go in for mouthfeel now. This is great. So this particular beer has so many individual ingredients in it, but the thing that really stands out for me, and especially in terms of the mouthfeel, is the Golden Naked Oats, because I am getting that characteristic oaty creaminess. Truth be told, there is a very distinct kind of mouthfeel character that comes from malted oats, and it's a really pleasant one in the right places, and this is doing exactly what I hoped it would. I'm trying my best to keep the carbonation a bit lower on this one, to really bring out that maltiness and to really emphasize that creaminess. But when you're taking a beer like this, it's normally served on a hand pull or off a cask, basically. And in the north, in Scotland, you would see that served with a sparkler. That would knock out lots of carbonation in the process. You're gonna get a very creamy, very smooth mouthfeel when it's served in that particular fashion. It's hard to emulate that without that particular equipment, but this is actually working pretty well, all things considered. Obviously, it's nowhere near that level of creaminess and, you know, fullness and just that amazing rich cask character. But really, honestly, for being served off a keg, that is not bad at all. And it takes me right back. And lastly, for the body on this beer, it is really a pretty solid, I'd say, medium full body. It's got more thickness to it and fullness to it than a dark lager, but it's got a lot less overall chewiness and fullness than a porter, I guess, is the nearest alternative. But it's a solid medium full. It's perfectly drinkable. It's something that makes me quite satisfied when I take a swig. All right, so now let's go in for flavor, because this beer is not holding back on flavor whatsoever, and I love it. This has got a very complex flavor, but it's dominated by malts. It's got, first of all, a pronounced toasted nut kind of character, like a hazelnut, maybe a chestnut. Specifically, that pale chocolate malt is responsible for a large portion of this flavor, in combination, of course, with the crystal malts that we put in and that solid base malt. It's really just got this rich nuttiness that is so pleasant. It's substantial, it's chewy, it's got so much flavor to it without being overly full and like intense. Such a hard thing to describe. But it's also got this really cool like milk chocolate flavor that I think is coming from the Carafa 3, potentially. It's just this really nice kind of softer, smooth, almost cooling milk chocolate effect. It's so cool. The other thing that's really cool about this is like the toffee, caramelized sugar kind of character to it. It's definitely not sweet. It's just more of that richness. To me, what this beer reminds me of is like a sticky toffee pudding, just not as sweet. And it blends really, really well with that nuttiness. And then there's also like a little bit of a dark fruit in there, like a darker raisin maybe. So the effect of this is it does seem very much like a really well-made, like a raisin fruitcake or like an English pudding, perhaps. It's got that unique dark fruit character in combination with these really nice caramelized sugars, and man, it is just so awesome. The finish on this has a nice drying effect. The roasted malt contribution is there. It's noticeable that it's a roasted malt, but it's not in any way, shape, or form presenting as an actual roast. It's just got that kind of drying effect at the end of the finish. And it's really nice, it's really balanced. It does exactly what I wanted it to do. And it keeps the sweetness in check, in a way. There's no hop flavor to this. It's not really got anything. And that's fine, because that's kind of what it was supposed to do. And there's no yeast character to this. This is a clean fermentation. What it does do is it pushes the malt forward, because the strains are known to do that. And it does kind of get out of the way, similar to the fuller strain, and give you this really nice malty experience without any sort of esters or phenols. But you get a lot of glycerol in there, which really helps with the body. I can't help but keep staring at this beer. The visual quality of this beer is so cool. And I know it's not really coming across on camera when I'm, front lit like this, but the dark red color that this beer has with its absolute perfect clarity, it's so beautiful in the glass. There's like a little bit of a toasted marshmallow thing going on now as this warms up. If it's not already overwhelmingly apparent, I'm enjoying this particular beer much more so than some of the more recent ones that I've made. This is so satisfying, but also it has that thing where it occupies a place in your heart, in your memory, You know, I remember drinking these ales in the pubs of Edinburgh during my honeymoon, and it was such a great memory. There really is no place like a good pub also, and it kind of brings that back in a way, and it means a lot to me to have that on tap. And I know it might be a simple detail to you guys. I know this glass is dirty. It's been in the dishwasher a few times. It's got that film on it. Can't get rid of it. But this glass was the one that I got from Cairngorm Brewing in Aviemore, Scotland, which had some of the best beers of the entire trip when I was on my honeymoon 3 years ago. And it's a special memory, and it means a lot to me to brew a Scottish ale and to put it in a Scottish beer glass that I picked up in Scotland. It's a simple thing, but it's one of the coolest things about this whole entire project. Normally I'd mention some potential improvements here, but to be honest with you, I don't think I have any. Maybe the only thing I could do to really improve this would be to lower the alcohol by volume, kind of thin out the body a little bit to make it even more drinkable, but it's already really drinkable. I'm gonna send it to some competitions to kind of see what other people think about it, because my frame of reference for a Scottish export is relatively narrow in terms of the craft examples that I've had. So I'm curious to see if this is really as good as I think it is. No matter how you slice it style-wise, it really does feel like it's an excellent beer, and it's one that I'm proud of no matter what category it fits into. So, you know, it could call this a brown ale if you wanted to. This is something that I'm incredibly proud of, and I really do recommend that you try this recipe out and brew it yourselves. And if you do, let me know how it turns out for you. This is such an underbrewed, underrepresented, and underappreciated style of beer, and it's one that I really wish I hadn't waited 5 years to go and rebrew. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it for you and sharing this beer with you as well. And if you did, and you found it useful, please go ahead, hit that like button, comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you want to support the channel, please consider picking up a t-shirt like this one. You can find this design and plenty of others in the merchandise store, which is linked in the description box down below the video. I also have a Patreon, and my patrons are truly an incredible source of funding for this channel. They help me to keep the passion alive. They help me to do things that I otherwise would not be able to do. Your funding goes to things like improving the production quality of the channel over time, and also getting interesting brewing gadgets like the beer engine that I still need to work on and maintain and clean, but otherwise would have used for this video. Things like that all come from Patreon funding, and it means a lot to me to have your support. So thank you very, very much to my current patrons. It does mean a lot. I also have channel memberships, and there's the super thanks button as other ways to help support the channel. If you don't want to do Patreon, totally fine. They're quick and easy ways to help support the channel, and all of that money goes right back into things. I also have an Amazon store where you can find all the channel's production equipment, as well as a lot of the home brewing equipment that is available on Amazon that I've used and recommend. If I do, it's on that store. And I also have Instagram and Facebook. If you're looking for more frequent content updates besides YouTube, you get to see kind of what's gonna happen in the future. You get to see what's coming to the channel. I share all the upcoming beers coming into my channel and what I'm brewing and stuff like that. So if you're kind of curious about what's gonna be happening next, that's a good place to go check out. And last but certainly not least, if you're still watching at this point, it means a lot to me because I know these videos can be kind of long. So if you're still watching, it means you're getting a lot out of it. And that's important to me because it tells me that what I'm doing means something as well. So this one goes out to you in particular. And until the next one, cheers.